I am who I am because it's been like Yun Chun-Li, grandfather, 1 in a billion ancestor. I need to define my space, define my face in this ancestral embrace that is skin tight, but my skin fits me just right. They're all there, my ancestral throne, for I am, we are, lifetimes infinite, billion strong.
Welcome, everyone. This is Mind Your Margins, a podcast that seeks to foster a space where it's humanly possible to make humanity possible. My name is Michelle Myers, and I'll be trying my best to help us navigate through topics about marginalized identities and prioritizing the perspectives of people who may feel invisible or silenced or ignored or erased. Also, I want to acknowledge that sometimes these conversations can be difficult, but I'm hoping that through these conversations, we can claim space for understanding and compassion. Hello, beautiful people. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you're all holding up as well as you can during these uncertain and unsettling times. I know for me, it's been very exhausting. But again, I hope that you're doing all you can to take some time for self-care and for really listening to your body and your spirit and taking care of your own needs. Before I get into today's topic, as I do at the beginning of every episode, I'm going to share a land acknowledgement statement. And in it, I pay my respects to the ancestors of the native peoples of this land in the hopes that by honoring them, I also honor my mother and my father, who are now both ancestors and whose spirits passed over on this land, and through them connect to my Korean ancestors and the land of my birth. I offer up this land acknowledgement statement not for show or political correctness. As someone who was not born here, I'm very much aware that I'm a visitor in this land, but I am rooted here. And I pray that the spirits and ancestors of this land will guide and protect me and keep me grounded. So I hope that you'll reflect on the words as I speak them. I acknowledge that the land on which I live and work are the ancestral lands of the Lenni Lenape people, whose presence and resilience in New Jersey, Eastern Pennsylvania, and Delaware continue to this day. I recognize that the place where I recorded this podcast also sits on the unceded homeland of the Lenape people. I and my listeners take this opportunity to honor the original caretakers of this land and to recognize the histories of land theft, violence, erasure, and oppression that has brought ourselves here. We are grateful to be guests in these lands and commit to solidarity in the struggle for Indigenous sovereignty. This land acknowledgement does not correct the wrongs committed against the Lenape or any of the other First Nation peoples across this continent, but through it, I hope to remind myself and my listeners of our connections and indebtedness to the Indigenous people of this land, and particularly of New Jersey, Eastern Pennsylvania, and Delaware. Saying their names and learning their histories call them into our consciousness and awareness. Thank you so very much for listening to that land acknowledgement statement. I want to begin this episode by actually drawing a direct line between that land acknowledgement statement and the topic I want to discuss, which is the role and function of higher education right now, because in our current moment, this question has become more urgent than ever. Higher education is under attack by the Trump administration. I mean, Vice President Vance openly declared in a keynote address, which he gave in November of 2021 at the National Conservatism Conference in Orlando, Florida, that, quote, "the professors are the enemies," end quote, which in and of itself was a quote he attributed to Richard Nixon, perhaps one of the most corrupt presidents and administrations in American history, with both Nixon and his own vice president, Spiro Agnew, being forced to resign. But these are different times right now, obviously, and For the Trump administration, that statement, the professors are the enemies, isn't just rhetoric. It's a real declaration of war on critical inquiry, diversity, and justice that take place within academic institutions. And we can see evidence of this attack since Trump took office, with the dismantling of the education department, with all of the cuts in federal funding to colleges and universities, and with the aggressive debt collection that Trump has resumed on defaulted student loans. And of course, the outright hostility directed towards colleges and universities that don't comply with Trump's demands. And in waging their cultural and political war against diversity, equity, and inclusion courses and initiatives at colleges and universities all over the United States, the Trump administration has made it very clear they are in it to win, because they view this as a battle to control the minds, bodies, and spirits of future generations. So it's not just about policy, it's about power. It's about controlling how future generations see the world and how they see themselves. So, taking all this into consideration, today I want to explore a very serious question, which lies at the heart of how we think about learning and justice in this country. Is higher education a pathway to empowerment, or is it in actuality a system of indoctrination? And that question becomes even more urgent when we ask, empowerment for whom? Indoctrination into what? Right now, I'd like for us to take a moment to reflect on the actual history of how education has often been used as a tool for cultural indoctrination and erasure. The land acknowledgement that I share at the beginning of each episode is the same land acknowledgement statement that I share with all of my students at the start of every course that I teach. And it's not just a symbolic gesture from me, it's a reminder. It's a reminder that erasure is ongoing. And that every time we step into a classroom or walk through our neighborhoods or come home at the end of the day, we are going about our daily lives on the unceded homelands of the Lenni Lenape people. And that all of these places that we take for granted every day, that all of these places are sites of cultural erasure and cultural violence. But even beyond bringing this to my students' awareness, it's a reminder to myself of my own responsibilities as an educator to make sure that I'm doing everything that I possibly can to resist normalizing structural racism within academic spaces. And this is so important for me to remember because just 2 hours from Philadelphia, near Harrisburg, sits the site of the Carlisle Indian Boarding School, an institution where Native children were forcibly removed by the federal government from their families and stripped of their languages and identities and subjected to assimilationist and indoctrinating policies. Its founder was a man named Captain Richard Henry Pratt, who made as the school's motto, "Kill the Indian, save the man." That was their mission statement. Kill the Indian, save the man. Carlisle became the model for Indian boarding schools across the United States, but also became a model for Indian boarding schools or indigenous boarding schools in other countries as well, including Canada, where they have found mass graves of Native children at some of these Indian boarding schools, as well as in Australia for the indigenous peoples there. And as I just mentioned, hundreds of children have died, if not thousands of children have died at these Indian boarding schools. And at Carlisle Indian Boarding School, their cemetery holds over 100 bodies. And only recently has the United States government begun returning these children's bodies to their families over a century later. So reading the land acknowledgement is my way of remembering that history and also making sure that I recommit to challenging the structures in higher education that continue to marginalize, silence, and harm. And if you're interested in learning more about the Carlisle Indian School, as well as other Indian boarding schools, I'll have Myung put some links in the episode description. So I've been questioning and thinking about these issues a great deal for a long time, and most recently, I discussed my reflections and viewpoints as part of a lecture that I gave at Community College of Philadelphia as the 2024 recipient of the Lindback Award for Distinguished Teaching. I also touched on these episodes back in episode 1 of this podcast because during the pandemic, the racism and elitism already embedded in academia became even more pronounced, and I was just really frustrated with it. And that's one of the reasons why I started Mind Your Margins, to amplify these conversations, because right now in this moment, educators are being called to choose. Will we uphold systems of exclusion, or will we stand boldly on the side of humanity? And it's imperative for our current students and our future students that we stand up on the side of humanity. You know, my youngest daughter, Vanessa, said something very profound to me recently after the whole Harvard thing, you know, where Harvard stood up to Trump's little petty tyrant demands. And it was so profound, and I've been quoting it as much as I can ever since. And what she said to me was, teachers have the most important jobs because they're preparing the next generation of human beings to be human beings. And I thought that she captured the urgency of what's happening right now in the most beautiful way. And that really lit my fire. It's something that I helped to motivate me when I was planning my Lindback lecture. And I quoted her during my Lindback lecture too. And I feel, again, compelled to share it with you all here. And so I need to emphasize, and I'm going to be stating this over and over again throughout this episode, we must stand up on the side of humanity. There's so much at stake with the attacks that the Trump administration is making against colleges and universities and higher education. But how do we come to terms with the discrepancies between the promise or the idealism surrounding higher education versus the reality of higher education as a tool of control? You know, we're often told that education is the quote-unquote great equalizer, that knowledge is power, and that a college education is the pathway to socioeconomic mobility. I mean, this is what we tell high school students, right? It's something that we've all bought into, especially in the last few decades. But we can actually trace these ideas back over 100 years ago. We can trace them all the way back to Horace Mann, the 19th century educational reformer, who was also known as the quote-unquote father of the American public school system. Basically, he created the American public school system. And while he was alive, he was the Secretary of Education in Massachusetts, and he believed that providing free, accessible education for children of all backgrounds, and he was an abolitionist, so he also believed in this for African American children. He believed that being able to provide free, accessible education for all children would not only initiate progress, but also end poverty. In an 1848 report to the Massachusetts Board of Education, Horace Mann said, quote, "Education then, beyond all other devices of human origin, is a great equalizer of the conditions of men," end quote. So in theory, education is how equality is achieved, right? So this is where it's through schools. Schools are where young people can sharpen their minds, where students prepare for their lives, not just for jobs, and where transformation and personal growth is possible. And if you're interested, if you've never heard of Horace Mann, and if you're interested in learning more about him, I can have Myung share a link to an excerpt of this particular report by Horace Mann in the episode description, which basically he's drawing a correlation between education and overcoming poverty. Okay. And so for many students, especially those from marginalized backgrounds, whether due to race, gender, class, disability, or immigration status, college can be a life-affirming space. In episode 1 of Mind Your Margins, I talked about how school saved my life. That's one of the reasons why I'm an educator, right? So yes, it can be a space where students find themselves, where it's some place where they can really stretch and grow and find their purpose in life. And so it is a life-affirming space. It's also a space where, in addition to self-discovery, students can build community, gain access to resources, and of course, earn credentials and their college degree, which will open up new doors for them. But here's the contradiction. Even as higher ed claims to empower, it often reinforces the inequalities it says it opposes. So let's think about that for a second. Let's sit with that, okay? We say college is a pathway to social mobility, yet tuition continues to rise. Student debt has surpassed $1.7 trillion in the United States. And the very students who need access the most are the ones who are crushed under the heaviest financial burdens. First-generation college students, students from low-income families, and students of color are disproportionately impacted, not just by cost, but by the cultural, institutional, and emotional labor it takes to navigate predominantly white, class-privileged, elitist academic spaces that were never designed with them in mind. So we have to call out the elitism and cultural exclusion and academic gatekeeping that have always done harm to our students. Even before this Trump era backlash, all these colleges and universities promoted themselves as being inclusive and diverse on their websites and in their brochures. But really, how often do their course syllabi actually reflect that? How often, really, are Indigenous, Black, Asian American Pacific Islander, Latinx, queer, and global perspectives centered, not as add-ons, but as foundational knowledge? How many professors who teach anti-racist curricula and decolonize their syllabi, how many of us feel genuinely supported in teaching inclusive, anti-racist, decolonialist curricula? And how many students are penalized, whether overtly or subtly, for not meeting a professor's ideas of compliance, or punished for asking the quote-unquote wrong kinds of questions, or for having the audacity to ask questions in the first place? You know, my son Victor told me recently that one of his professors once said on the very first day of class, "I'm not a teacher. It's not my job to make sure you understand the material." What kind of shit is that? Seriously, as an educator myself, I want to know, because what Victor's professor said isn't just rude or dismissive. It actually reflects a widespread and deeply damaging belief system within academia itself, that teaching is secondary or even inferior to elitist ideas regarding acceptable modes of quote-unquote scholarship, and that knowledge transmission is a one-way street from the professor/expert to the student/non-expert, and never the other way around, and that empathy and accessibility and clarity are somehow the enemies of intellectual quote-unquote rigor. And this kind of intellectual hazing, and that is what I consider it to be, a hazing of our students. This intellectual hazing makes it clear to our students that they must earn the right to join this exclusive club called quote-unquote academia. That in order to be deemed worthy of a passing grade and by extension a college degree, they must submit and shut up and do as they're told, or they'll be penalized, and that their very futures could be ruined. That's the academic gatekeeping that I referred to earlier, that we decide who's successful and who's not, who gets to have a career and who doesn't, who has a life ahead of them and who doesn't, right? That's that academic gatekeeping. And that's communicated loud and clear to our students. And whether it's something that's stated to them explicitly or not, they understand that what's being told to them is that if you don't already know how to thrive in this environment, then you don't belong here. And fundamentally, that way of viewing education and those kinds of approaches to teaching, that's not education. That's not education. That's exclusion. In order to combat these oppressive structures within higher ed, we must ask the hard questions and demand answers with persistence. Who determines what knowledge is valued? Who shapes the curriculum? Who decides who gets hired and who receives tenure? Who identifies which departments and programs get funding? And perhaps most urgently in today's political climate, who decides what happens when students speak out, when they advocate, when they protest? For example, let's take the case of Mahmoud Khalil, a Columbia graduate student arrested for protesting against Israel's war and genocide on Gaza. He now faces deportation not for violence, but for demanding justice. This case shows an alarming escalation in the criminalization of dissent and the repression of political speech, especially when that speech comes from students of color or from Muslims or from those who refuse to stay silent in the face of genocide, or from anyone who speaks out against Trump and the US government. This case also shows that higher ed is not a neutral space. It can be a battleground where students risk their lives and their futures for the right to speak truth to power. And when colleges and universities are complicit in punishing students like Mahmoud rather than protecting them, they're not defending freedom. They're selling out their soul. But let me be clear. This is not an argument against education. I'm an educator. I've given my life to this. This is a call for an educational system rooted in care, inclusion, and transformation, not control, compliance, and silence. This is a call for an educational system that recognizes learning as a collective process, not a commodity, not as a business, one that sees and treats students as co-creators of knowledge, not customers to be managed, or products to be produced, or a workforce to be trained. One that views education not as a tool for assimilation, but as a path to liberation. And as educators, it's incumbent upon us to resist perpetuating structures of oppression within our curricula and classroom spaces. Because if education only teaches students how to fit into a broken world, then it's complicit in that brokenness. We need to move beyond the idea of education as merely a pipeline to employment, and instead reimagine it as a practice of freedom. And one of the most powerful voices on this topic is the late Bell Hooks, an author, scholar, educator, and activist who deeply understood both the promise and the pitfalls of education. Bell Hooks argued that traditional models of education often reproduce systems of domination. In her book, Teaching to Transgress, Education as the Practice of Freedom, she writes that education, quote, as the practice of freedom, end quote, is rare because most classrooms function as spaces of control rather than liberation, because the teachers hold the power while the students are expected to be silent, and knowledge flows only one way, from professor to student. But as Bell Hooks pointed out, true learning must be participatory and transformative. It must center the voices and experiences of those who have historically been marginalized, and it must challenge, not reinforce, oppressive structures. She called for what she termed, quote unquote, engaged pedagogy, where the classroom is a space of mutual vulnerability, dialogue, and care, where professors are active listeners to their students and learn from their students. Bell Hooks didn't see students as empty vessels or problems to be fixed. She saw them as co-creators of knowledge. Her approach wasn't just about adding diverse content to the syllabus. It was about radically rethinking how we define knowledge in the first place. But she was clear that education could easily go the other way when institutions focus on compliance and conformity. Paulo Freire, the Brazilian educator whose book titled Pedagogy of the Oppressed, reimagines teaching as a collaborative act that has the potential and the power to restore humanity. And he called it the quote-unquote banking model of education, where students are empty vessels to be filled, not agents of their own transformation. This model, this banking model, doesn't empower. It prepares students to comply, to fit into systems of conformity and capitalism, and also trains them not to question it, so they become good little workers. Just like how our society and our colleges pressure students to focus on marketable skills rather than critical thinking. So when tuition costs rise and students take out more loans and sink deeper into debt, there's this overwhelming pressure to make college, quote unquote, worth it so that they can pay off that student loan debt, or to pay their bills, or to be able to just survive on a day-to-day. And this can push students, especially low-income and working-class students, toward career paths that promise security but may not align with their passions or values. Then essentially education becomes merely transactional, not transformative or empowering or life-affirming. And for marginalized students, the barriers extend far beyond finances. They sit in classes where the material is centered in whiteness. They have to deal with professors who gaslight or dismiss them. And they have to navigate classroom spaces that silence their ways of knowing and being and how they experience the world. From first-generation college students to students of color to queer and trans students to disabled students, many of these students enter spaces that were never meant to include them. And they feel excluded, and they don't know where to turn. And this is precisely the vision the Trump administration is advancing, not higher ed as liberation, but as indoctrination. And so how do we move from awareness to action? Well, first, let's just call out the contradiction. Let's call out the problem. Colleges are inherently contested spaces. They hold both pain and possibility. A student may find their voice in one classroom and feel erased in the next. One professor might encourage them to ask questions and think critically, while another might silence them and intimidate them to stay in line. But I think being aware of these contradictions is in itself a form of empowerment. Because as Bell Hooks observed, teaching is never neutral. So once we understand education as a site of power, then we can begin to reshape it. Students can challenge curricula, can call out course content that erases their histories. Faculty can adopt inclusive, anti-oppressive, and anti-racist pedagogy. Institutions can be held accountable to the communities they claim to serve. And then learning can truly be transformative and liberating. And the truly inclusive classroom is where we can claim space, build community, and imagine new possibilities. Because when colleges and universities gatekeep knowledge, they're also gatekeeping humanity. So as we think about our own roles as students, as educators, as advocates, we should keep asking the hard questions. Whose knowledge is valued? Who feels safe to speak? Who gets to shape the narrative? Only by facing these questions can we move from indoctrination to empowerment and to understand what it means to prepare the next generation of human beings to be human beings as my daughter Vanessa put it. As an educator, I believe that standing on the side of humanity means refusing to accept apathy in the face of injustice. It means teaching in ways that affirm students' lived experiences, that name systems of oppression, and that dream into existence more humane possibilities in the service of justice and human dignity and respect. And if the purpose of higher education is to empower our students, this next generation of human beings, then it must be willing to confront its own limitations. It must fully listen to the voices of those it has historically silenced and be committed to fully seeing those it has erased. And it must be brave enough to change, not just who gets in, but what happens once they're there. I plan to continue discussing this in my next episode by focusing more on ways that education is a pathway to empowerment and unpacking what the Trump administration really means when they make it clear that they regard professors as the enemy, and taking into consideration today's hostile climate against professors who are actively trying to implement teaching practices that center justice, care, and critical thinking in their classrooms. I'll also talk more about what resistance looks like in academia today, what solidarity means in practice, and what it means to teach from the margins for the margins. So just like I did last episode, I'm going to finish by pulling an oracle card and reflecting on the meaning and how we might use its message as guidance for mindfulness and reflection and meditation. I really had fun doing that last episode, and I hope you also enjoyed it or at least found it interesting. This time, I'm going to try to describe the artwork on the card as best as I can, but will still post the image of the card on social media in case you want to see it for yourself. And again, I want to be clear, this is not tarot or divination or anything like that. I don't claim to be a reader or a psychic or anything like that. I don't claim any of that. I've just been using oracle cards as a tool for affirmation for the past year because I am a visual person and I really enjoy looking at art, and some of the artwork on the oracle cards that I have really inspire me, and I really love to interpret the symbols or the symbolism that I see in the oracle cards and derive meaning from it. And that helps me to move forward in my own life in intentional and meaningful ways. So since I've been doing that, it's also something that I've been doing a lot in the past year, and it's been very helpful for me. And I just thought it would be fun to incorporate it into the podcast. So I'm still experimenting with it. We'll see. So just like I did last time, I'm using the Medicine Woman Oracle deck, and the cards in this deck are organized into 4 different categories. The first one is Archetypal Medicine Women. The second one is Gifts of the Feminine. The third one is Animal Totems and Allied Spirits. And the fourth one is Medicine Action. And as you can tell, this deck emphasizes sacred feminine energy, but I hope no matter how you identify in terms of your gender, that you'll be open to the message that is shared today. And just for clarification, what I mean by divine sacred feminine energy is a reconnection with the deeper, more intuitive and compassionate aspects of being, both for personal growth and as a larger force of healing and transformation in the world. I view it as the creative force of the universe, symbolizing the power of birth, growth, and transformation. It's also a source of deep inner knowing with an emphasis on trusting our inner voice and feeling more deeply connected to a higher sense of balance and wholeness. So right now, I'm just going to shuffle the deck, pull a card, and I'll describe it, and then we'll see what kind of meaning or message that we can get. Okay, so the card that I pulled is titled Healing. It's card number 8. And on the card, it says, I support you on the path of healing. On this card is a woman, and she is balancing something on top of her head. It looks like it could be a basket, but we can't see the whole thing. We can't see the entire object, so we don't know if it's a basket or not. It could be a headdress because it is part of the archetypal medicine women cards. And so all of the women that are featured on these cards are supposed to be shamans. They're all quote unquote medicine women. So they're healers. And they're very much connected to the ancestral world. So they mediate between the ancestral world and the earthly world. And so in the book, it does suggest that, or it does state, I shouldn't say it suggests, it does state that this particular shaman is a shaman of healing. And I think that what is emphasized, or what's being emphasized here, is trying to connect to an inner source of strength that will enable us to, first of all, recognize where we might have some pain, where we might have some trauma, where we have challenges, where we're struggling, just on a basic level where we're struggling. And oftentimes when we think about struggle, we think about them, of course, as being obstacles, and perhaps also interpreting those obstacles as a way to thwart us, right? As these walls that are being thrown up in front of us so that we can't achieve what it is that we want to achieve. But we also have to remember that sometimes obstacles are a way for us to go through a rite of passage. And it's in confronting these obstacles and pulling from our own inner strength and our own inner fortitude, and also recognizing that we have resources available to us and we do have a support system. If we draw on all of this, on all of these sources, resources, support, as well as our own inner strength, then we can overcome those obstacles. We can change something that is challenging to us into something that could become our greatest accomplishment. This reminds me of a speech, actually, that one of my students gave in my public speaking class this semester. And the topic of his speech was that failures are necessary for us to be successful. And so we shouldn't see failures as failures, that we should actually be grateful when we fail, because it's through our failures that we learn and that we grow, and that in finding our own strength and pulling from our own strength, then we understand that we're building our own pathway to success and fulfillment. And that's kind of what I'm getting from this card. So whatever it is that we might be experiencing in our lives, we might find it to be challenging or exhausting. It might even be something that we are interpreting as being toxic. But if we shift our mindset and that we recognize that everything that's happening to us is really happening for us, right? Let me say that again. Everything that's happening to us is really happening for us. And as long as that we recognize that, and as long as we see it as an opportunity for us to create our own reality and to recognize that we're the ones who are making the choices in our lives, and we can make our lives into what we want as long as that we are persistent about it. We can transmute something that's toxic into something that's a blessing. And so that's what I'm feeling in this card. I support you on the path of healing, whatever that process might be for you in this moment. I hope that you will think about that. And then whatever is challenging you, release it. Release it. And I hope that you can find a meditative practice or something else, maybe a symbolic kind of ritual that will help you to do that releasing. Whether for you it's saying a prayer, or maybe lighting some incense, or lighting a candle. I did this activity with my students, again, in my public speaking class, because they come to the class with so much anxiety about talking in front of others. And so the activity I did with them was I gave them all a sheet of paper, and they wrote down what it was that they were actually afraid of. Like, to be honest, and no one was going to read it. I wasn't going to read it. That's what I told them. Nobody's reading this. I'm not reading this. You're not turning this into me. This is you talking to yourself. Like, write down on your sheet of paper what it is that you're actually afraid of when it comes to talking in front of others. And that's what they did. And then I had them fold it up. And then I also told them, I said, so now I want you to make a promise to yourself that you are going to be kind to yourself, and that you are going to do everything that you can to confront those fears, embrace those fears, understand what those fears are there to try to protect you from, and to tell yourself, the self that's afraid, that everything is going to be okay. And that you can stand in your own power, because now you are in a place of strength where you can protect yourselves. And so I made every single one of my students make that promise to themselves. And once they had made that promise to themselves, I said, when they were ready, when they felt like they were really saying it to themselves in a sincere way, I said, I want you to rip up that paper, the paper of your fears, and release them. And so then when they were I gave them that time and space in class. And I said, when you're ready, let me know, rip up your paper, and then you're going to throw it, like physically throw it into this trash can and release it. And that's what I did. So each one of them they really did this in a very sincere and genuine way. Like, they each took their own time. They weren't rushing through it. And they really talked to themselves silently, and they raised their hand to let me know they were ready. And when I came over that trash can, they ripped up that paper and they threw it in the trash. And I really feel as though for them, it was healing. It was a very healing activity. And so maybe I only share that with you because maybe that's something that would be helpful to you. Okay. So I hope that you found this interesting as far as this card and what we talked about and the meaning of this card. And I do hope that it has some kind of resonance for you in your own life. I am going to take a photo of this card, and if I try to describe it as best I can, but these cards are very intricate in terms of their detail, so I really cannot do justice to describing these cards. And I do think it's important for you to look at it for yourself, and you'll see things that will stand out to you that won't necessarily stand out to me. So I'm going to take a photo of this. I'm going to put it on social media. I'll be putting it on my personal social media as well as on the Mind Your Margins Facebook page, and Myung will put it on the Instagram and any other social media platforms that we're on. Okay. And as I said, I really truly hope that you found this message helpful and healing. Thank you so very much again for listening. I'm grateful to you for spending this time with me and sharing space. For those of you who are interested, Myung will share the links to information about the Carlisle Indian boarding schools and other Indian boarding schools, and to information about Horace Mann, Bell Hooks, and Paulo Freire. And if you'd like to contact Myung and me, you can reach out to us via email at mindyourmargins@gmail.com and on our social media, whether on Facebook or Instagram. Myung and I also hope you will like and follow us on these social media platforms, as well as subscribe to our podcast so you'll be notified when a new episode has posted. And if you know anyone who you think might be interested in hearing our podcast, I hope that you will recommend it to them and share it with them. Until we share space again, please be mindful of yourselves and mindful of others. Take good care.
I am who I am because it's been like young Chun-Li, grandfather, one in a billion ancestor. I need to define my space, define my face in this ancestral embrace that is skin tight, but my skin fits me just right. They're all there, my ancestral throne, for I am, we are, lifetimes infinite, billion strong.